The frozen earth fought back with every swing of the pickaxe. It was a stubborn, unyielding thing, much like the grief that had taken root in Clara May Whitlock's chest. Each blow sent a shockwave up her arms, through her shoulders, and into a heart that felt just as cold and hard as the ground she was breaking. Snow fell in lazy, silent spirals, clinging to the brim of her late husband's hat and melting on the hot tracks of her tears. She was digging alone. Thomas deserved more than this, more than a shallow grave scraped out of the unforgiving Wyoming soil by his 24-year-old widow. But there was no one else to do the digging. The pine box, hammered together from old barnwood, sat beside the hole. It was too light. A man like Thomas, broad and vital, should have weighed more. But death had whittled him down, just as this land whittled down everything it touched. Clara May paused, leaning on the handle of the pickaxe, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her hands, chapped and raw inside thin leather gloves, screamed with a pain that was blessedly physical. It was a welcome distraction from the hollow ache that had been her constant companion for 3 days. Finally, the hole was deep enough, barely. She muscled the coffin to the edge, her worn boots slipping on the icy ground. With a final, desperate shove, it tumbled in, landing with a dull, final thud. The sound echoed the closing of a door she could never reopen. She did not say a prayer. The words felt like ash in her mouth. God had been absent when the shot was fired, and he was absent now. Instead, she just stood there, watching the snow begin to blanket the raw wood, a soft, white shroud for a man who had died so violently. Then, with the methodical, grim determination of a soul with nothing left to lose, she picked up the shovel and began to fill the grave. The scraping of metal on frozen dirt was the only sound in a world that had gone utterly silent. The silence did not last. Back in the small town of Redemption, a place that had never offered her any, the silence was broken by whispers. When she had ridden in for supplies 2 days after finding him, the words followed her like a shadow. They murmured in the general store while she traded her last few eggs for flour and salt. They rustled behind cupped hands at the saloon, where men who had once clapped Thomas on the back now looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. "Found him face down in the snow, out by the creek," she heard one man say to another over the rim of a whiskey glass. "Bullet in his back, clean through. No tracks but his own," another added, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Sheriff didn't even ride out, called it a hunting accident." A hunting accident. The lie was so blatant, so insulting, it stole the air from her lungs. Men were not accidentally shot in the back while checking their own trap lines. But no one was arrested. No one was even questioned. The law in this part of the country was a thin, frayed rope, and it did not stretch as far as the isolated Whitlock homestead. The townsfolk, left without a villain, began to craft one of their own. The whispers turned accusatory. A pretty young wife, a husband growing distant and strange, a remote ranch where anything could happen. It was a story as old as the hills, and they told it with relish. They looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the grim set of her jaw, and saw not a grieving widow but a woman with a secret. The cruelest blow came not from a stranger, but from family. A week after the burial, a boy from a neighboring ranch delivered a letter. It was from Jebediah Whitlock, her father-in-law, a stern, unyielding man who had never approved of his son's choice of a bride from a family with no land and no name. The paper was stiff, the handwriting a series of angry, black slashes. "Clara May," it began, with no warmth or salutation. "You have brought shame upon this family. My son is dead, and his good name is being dragged through the mud in a town that once respected him. A wife's duty is to her husband. You failed in that duty. You did not keep him safe. You did not keep your man alive. Do not write to us again. You are no longer our concern." She read the letter 3 times, her mind refusing to accept the words. He blamed her. He truly, honestly blamed her, as if she could have stood between Thomas and the bullet. as if her love was a shield that had somehow failed. She crumpled the letter in her fist, the sharp edges of the paper digging into her palm. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she opened the stove door and dropped the wad of paper into the flames. She watched it curl, blacken, and turn to weightless ash, wishing she could do the same to the pain in her heart. With the town and family turned against her, the vultures began to circle. They came on horseback, dressed in town clothes that looked out of place against the wild backdrop of her ranch. Mr. Davies from the bank was the first. He was a small man with a neat mustache and cold, calculating eyes. He dismounted, tipping his hat with a practiced courtesy that did not reach his eyes. "Mrs. Whitlock," he said, his tone oozing a false sympathy. "My deepest condolences. A terrible tragedy." Clara stood on the porch, her husband's old Winchester rifle held loosely in her hands. She did not invite him inside. "What do you want, Mr. Davies?" He cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the homestead, lingering on the sagging fence line and the peeling paint of the cabin. "I am simply here to discuss the outstanding loan. Thomas, God rest his soul, was a bit behind. I understand this is a difficult time, but the bank must consider its position." "I'll pay you," she said, her voice flat, "when I sell the cattle in the spring." "Spring is a long way off, my dear," he said, smiling a thin, bloodless smile. "The land itself is collateral, of course. Perhaps it would be best to consider selling. A woman alone. This is no place for you. Or," he added, his eyes glinting, "perhaps you might consider another arrangement, a new husband to take on the debt. Perhaps a woman of your attributes should not have trouble finding a suitable provider." The implication was as clear as it was foul. "Sell your land or sell yourself?" She gripped the rifle tighter, the cold wood a comfort against her trembling hands. "Get off my land, Mr. Davies." His smile vanished. "As you wish, Mrs. Whitlock, but the debt remains. The bank will be in touch." He was not the only one. Others came. Men Thomas owed money to for feed, for whiskey, for things Clara knew nothing about. They all said the same things. They were sorry for her loss. But business was business. The pressure mounted, a physical weight that settled on her shoulders, making it hard to breathe. They wanted her land, her home, the last piece of her life with Thomas. The land itself seemed to conspire against her. The cold deepened. The pantry, once stocked for the winter, grew sparse. The flour sack was less than half full. The jars of preserved peaches and beans dwindled one by one. She rationed her food, eating only enough to quell the gnawing hunger in her belly. She grew thinner, her dress hanging loose on her frame, the bones of her face more prominent. And at night, the wolves came. At first, their howls were a distant, mournful song on the wind. But as the weeks passed, they grew bolder, their calls closer, sharper. She would lie awake in her cold bed, the rifle on the floor beside her, listening. She could hear them padding through the snow just beyond the cabin walls, their sniffs and low growls a terrifying reminder of her vulnerability. She was one woman against the wilderness, and the wilderness was hungry. Sleep, when it came, was no escape. It was a treacherous country populated by ghosts. Sometimes she dreamed of Thomas as he had been in the beginning, his hands gentle, his laughter filling the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He would touch her face, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw, and she would lean into his touch, a wave of love and longing so powerful it felt real. Then the dream would curdle, his face would change, his eyes growing hard and shadowed, the way they had been in that last year. The smell of whiskey would be on his breath. He would pull away from her, his touch turning rough, his words slurred and angry. She would wake with a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs, the phantom touch of his hand still on her skin. She would find herself on the floor, tangled in her blankets, sobbing into the cold. Splintered wood. The line between memory and nightmare hopelessly blurred. The past and the present were both a threat, and she was trapped between them. She was down to her last salted pork and a handful of withered potatoes when he appeared. The snow had stopped, and the world was bathed in the pale, flat light of a winter afternoon. She saw him from the window, a lone figure on horseback moving slowly up the track to her cabin. He was not one of the town men. He was tall and lean, slumped in the saddle with the weariness of a man who has ridden too far for too long. He led his horse with a noticeable limp. Clara's hand went instantly to the Winchester. She moved to the door, pulling it open just a crack, the barrel of the rifle resting in the gap. He stopped his horse a respectable distance from the porch, raised a hand in a gesture that was both a greeting and a sign of peace, and swung himself down from the saddle. He moved slowly, favoring his left leg. He wore a dusty, worn duster, a battered hat pulled low over his eyes, and the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into a man's bones. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, rough sound, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. It was the first human voice she had heard in over a week that wasn't her own. "State your business," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. The rifle remained pointed in his general direction. He nodded toward the barn. "Saw your sign from the main trail. Work for keep. Is that still true?" Clara had forgotten about the sign. Thomas had nailed it to the gatepost 2 years ago. "I don't have money to pay." "Sign says work for keep, not for pay," he replied, his gaze steady. "I can mend fence, chop wood, tend to stock. Just looking for a roof over my head for a spell. A warm meal." He looked her up and down, and for the first time, his expression shifted. She saw a flicker of something in his eyes, not pity, but a quiet, somber understanding. They were haunted eyes. She realized, as if he were looking at her and seeing a ghost from his own past. "Looks like you could use the help." She should have said no. Every instinct screamed at her to send him away. A strange man, a drifter. It was not safe. But then she looked at the wood pile, which was nearly gone. She thought of the fence line by the north pasture, trampled by elk and letting the wind in. She thought of the silence, the crushing, terrifying silence of being alone with the wolves and the ghosts. This man's silence felt different. It felt solid, contained. It felt less dangerous than the emptiness that surrounded her. "The barn," she said, her voice tight. "You can sleep in the barn. There's a clean stall. I'll give you what food I have." He just nodded once, a gesture of silent acceptance. "Name's Elias Granger." "Clara May Whitlock," she replied, though she did not lower the rifle until he had led his horse toward the barn and disappeared inside. She stood there for a long time, watching the closed barn door, a new kind of fear coiling in her stomach. It was the fear of the unknown, but it was a welcome change from the fear of the known. That night was different. The silence in the cabin was still there, but it was no longer absolute. She was aware of his presence out in the barn, a single point of human warmth in the vast, cold emptiness. It did not make her feel safe. Not exactly, but it made her feel marginally less alone. She ate her meager supper of boiled potatoes by the fire, her ears straining for any sound from the barn. She heard nothing. She dreamed of Thomas again. The good dream. They were newly married, building this very cabin. He swung the axe, his muscles straining, his face bright with sweat and love. He caught her watching him and grinned, a wide, wonderful grin that made her heart ache. He walked over to her, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, and pulled her into his arms. He smelled of sawdust and sunshine. He kissed her, a deep, possessive kiss that promised a lifetime of days just like this one. She woke up on the floor, a single, desolate sob tearing from her throat. The dream had been so real, the loss so absolute. The cabin was freezing, the fire having died down to embers. She lay there, shivering, the ghost of her husband's kiss still on her lips, the reality of his absence, a physical blow. She was drowning in it. The next morning, she woke to a new sound, the rhythmic, steady thump, thump, thump of an axe splitting wood. She looked out the window and saw Elias by the woodpile. He had already chopped a considerable stack. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements economical despite his limp. He did not seem to notice the cold. He had taken off his duster, and his worn shirt was stretched taut across his broad back. She watched him for a while, unseen. He did not rush. He just worked when the wood was stacked neatly against the cabin wall. He picked up a hammer and some nails from the porch and began repairing the loose hinge on the shed door. He said nothing to her when she finally came outside, just gave her a brief nod. He did not ask for breakfast. He did not ask for anything. He simply saw what needed to be done and did it. His silence was a strange comfort. He did not offer empty platitudes about her loss. He did not look at her with pity. He just existed in the space around her, a quiet, solid presence. He saw her pain. She knew he did. She saw it in the way his gaze would sometimes rest on her when he thought she was not looking. He saw the way she flinched at sudden noises, the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee. He saw it, and he said nothing, and for that, she was grateful. He recognized this landscape. He had walked it himself. A few days later, she managed to shoot a small buck that had wandered too close to the cabin, driven by hunger. It was a blessing, a promise of meat for another week or two, but the work of butchering it was grim and bloody. She laid it out on a rough wooden table behind the cabin, the cold numbing her fingers as she worked with the skinning knife. She was tired. Her movements were clumsy. The memories of doing this with Thomas, of his easy strength and laughter beside her, kept intruding. Her eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. The knife, slick with blood, slipped. A searing, white-hot pain shot through her left wrist. She cried out, dropping the knife, and stared in horror at the deep, gaping cut. Blood welled up instantly, shockingly red against the white snow. It dripped from her fingertips, staining the pristine ground. Panic seized her. It was a bad cut, deep. She pressed her other hand against it, but the blood seeped through her fingers. She felt dizzy, the world tilting on its axis. "Ma'am." His voice cut through the fog of her fear. Elias was there, having come around the corner of the cabin. He took in the scene in a single glance. Her, the blood, the knife on the ground. He moved without hesitation. He ripped a long, clean strip from the bottom of his own shirt, his movements quick and sure. "Let me see," he said, his voice calm and steady. She was trembling too hard to resist. He took her injured wrist in his hand. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his calloused fingers warm against her icy skin. He wrapped the cloth tightly around the wound, his brow furrowed in concentration. He tied it off with a practiced knot, creating a firm pressure bandage. The simple, practical act of kindness was more than she could bear. It was the first gentle touch she had felt since her husband had died. It was a touch that asked for nothing, a touch that was meant only to help, to heal. A dam inside her broke. A great shuddering sob escaped her lips, followed by another, and another. The tears she had held back for weeks finally came. A hot, cleansing flood. She sank to her knees in the snow, her body racked with a grief so profound it felt like it would tear her apart. She cried for Thomas, for the man he was and the man he had become. She cried for her lost future, for her isolation, for the crushing weight of it all. Elias did not move away. He knelt in front of her, his large frame a solid presence in her collapsing world. He did not touch her again, but he stayed, his silence a shield against the howling emptiness. He let her weep until the storm inside her began to subside, leaving her empty and shivering. She looked up at him, her vision blurred, her face streaked with tears and grime. He was a stranger, a drifter with haunted eyes and a past he never spoke of. But he was here. He was real, and she was so terribly, terribly alone. The words came out in a choked, desperate whisper, a confession and a plea all in one. "You're not him, but I need you." The words hung in the air between them for days, unspoken but heavy as a shroud. "I need you." Clara had confessed it in a moment of raw, unvarnished despair, and neither of them knew what to do with the truth of it. So they did nothing. Elias stayed, and the rhythm of their days settled into a quiet routine, dictated by the relentless demands of survival. His limp was a steady, percussive beat against the frozen ground as he moved from one task to the next. He mended the section of fence in the north pasture, his hands, though gloved, working with a deftness that spoke of long practice. He rethatched a leaking patch on the barn roof, cleared the snow from the path to the well, and methodically sawed and split the wood he chopped until a formidable stack stood against the cabin wall, a bulwark against the deepening winter. He never asked if he should stay another day. Clara never offered it. His presence became a fact, like the low-hanging gray sky or the bite of the wind. She would leave a plate of food on the table for him, and when she returned, it would be empty. In the evenings, he would sometimes sit on the porch steps, sharpening a knife or mending a piece of leather, his silhouette a dark, solitary shape against the blue twilight. He was a ghost of a man, occupying the spaces her husband had left empty. Yet he was nothing like Thomas. His silence was not the angry, brooding silence Thomas had adopted in his final year. It was a watchful, patient quiet, the stillness of a man who had learned that words were often useless things. Slowly, tentatively, Clara began to fill that silence. It started one evening as they sat inside the cabin, the only time she had invited him in from the cold. A fierce wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, and the warmth of the stove was a small circle of comfort in a vast, hostile world. He was cleaning her rifle, his movements precise and economical, while she darned a tear in one of Thomas's old flannel shirts. The familiar scent of the fabric, of wood smoke and faint, lingering sweat, pricked at her. "He wasn't always like that," she said, her voice so soft it was nearly lost in the shriek of the wind. Elias did not look up from his work, but his hands stilled for a fraction of a second. It was the only sign he was listening. Encouraged by the lack of interruption, she continued, the words spilling out in a hesitant trickle, like the first thaw of a frozen creek. Before the last year, he used to laugh, all the time. He had a big, loud laugh that made the whole cabin feel warm. She looked down at the shirt in her lap. "He built this place with his own hands, said he was building a kingdom for me." She fell silent, lost in the memory. Elias carefully oiled a moving part on the rifle, his focus absolute, giving her the space to either continue or retreat. "Then something changed," she whispered. "He started going into town more, coming back late, smelling of whiskey and something else, something sour. Fear, I think." She risked a glance at him. His face was unreadable in the flickering lamplight, all shadows and sharp angles. He started drinking heavy. He would sit right there. She nodded toward the empty chair by the hearth, and just stare into the fire for hours, not saying a word. If I tried to talk to him, he'd get angry, accuse me of things, of watching him, of talking to other men when I went for supplies. A knot of shame and sorrow tightened in her chest. He started to disappear. He'd be gone for 2-3 days at a time. Wouldn't say where he'd been. He'd come back with his clothes torn, looking wild-eyed and spooked, like a coyote with the hounds on its tail. He frightened me. The admission was a painful, bitter thing on her tongue. It felt like a betrayal. He wasn't my Thomas anymore. But I still loved him. God help me, I loved the man he used to be, and I kept hoping I'd find him again underneath all that darkness. She finally finished, the confession leaving her feeling hollowed out and raw. Elias finished his task, clicking the rifle back together with a solid, satisfying sound. He looked at her then, his haunted eyes holding hers for a long moment. He didn't offer sympathy or judgment. He just gave a slow, single nod. It was enough. It was an acknowledgement of her truth, a quiet testament that she had been heard. He understood darkness. While Clara slowly unburdened herself of the past, Elias remained a locked room. He revealed nothing of where he'd come from or where he was going. His history was a blank page, but his nights were filled with ghosts. Clara would wake to sounds from the barn, carried on the thin, cold air, muffled shouts, a strangled cry. Once, she heard him thrash against the wooden wall of the stall, a series of dull thuds followed by a string of pained, guttural curses. One night, the wind was still, and the silence was deep. A cry from the barn, sharper this time, pierced the quiet. Clara crept to her window, peering through the frosted glass. There was no movement, only the vast, star-dusted emptiness of the night. Then she heard it, a name, muttered in the ragged cadence of a nightmare. "Sarah, I'm sorry, Sarah." It was a plea, filled with an agony so profound it made Clara's own grief feel less solitary. She heard the sound of a gunshot then, a sharp, explosive cry that was not real but imagined, a phantom echo from his memory. After that, there was only a broken, wrenching silence. She backed away from the window, her heart pounding. Elias Granger was not just a quiet man. He was a man haunted by a violence that woke him in the night, a man tethered to a ghost named Sarah. Their fragile peace was shattered a week later by the sound of approaching horses. It was not the single, plodding gait of a neighbor. This was the confident, purposeful tread of 3 riders. Clara's stomach clenched. She saw them from the window. Mr. Davies, the banker, and with him 2 other men she had never seen before. They were large, hard-faced men, with unshaven jaws and revolvers holstered high and ready. They rode as if they owned the land, their horses trampling the sparse winter grass near the cabin. Elias was at the woodpile. He did not stop his work, but Clara saw the subtle shift in his posture. He set his axe down and stood a little straighter, his body angled toward the riders, his hand resting casually on his hip, near the worn handle of his own pistol. He was no longer a simple farmhand. He was a sentinel. Clara stepped onto the porch, her Winchester held loosely in her arms. "Davies," she said, her voice cold. The banker dismounted, his town shoes sinking into the mud. He gave her a smile that did not touch his eyes. "Mrs. Whitlock, I trust you are well. I was in the area and thought I would stop by to check on your situation. These gentlemen, Mr. Boone and Mr. Cutter, were kind enough to accompany me." The 2 men remained on their horses, looming over her. Their eyes roamed over her body with a lazy insolence that made her skin crawl. One of them, a man with a scarred lip, spat a stream of tobacco juice near her steps. "My situation is my own concern," Clara said, her grip tightening on the rifle. "Ah, but the bank has a vested interest in your situation," Davies said smoothly, gesturing around the homestead with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is a lot of land for a woman to handle alone. A lot of potential." The scarred man, Boone, let out a low chuckle. He nudged his partner with an elbow, his gaze sweeping toward the rolling hills behind the ranch. "Heard tell there's gold in them hills," he muttered, just loud enough for them all to hear. The words meant nothing to Clara. Prospectors were always claiming to find gold, silver, or copper in these parts. It was usually just fool's hope. But as she glanced at Elias, she saw his jaw clench, a muscle twitching in his cheek. His eyes, fixed on the 2 riders, had gone flat and cold as river stones. He understood something she did not. "My husband never mentioned any gold," Clara said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. "Perhaps your husband kept secrets, ma'am," Davies said, his smile widening. "Many men do. In any case, We will not trouble you further today. Just a friendly visit. But do consider my previous offer. It would be a shame for you to lose everything." He tipped his hat, climbed back onto his horse, and the three of them turned and rode away, leaving a trail of churned mud and palpable menace in their wake. Clara watched them go, her heart hammering against her ribs. As soon as they were out of sight, Elias walked over to her. He took the rifle from her trembling hands and leaned it against the cabin wall. His face was grim. "They weren't here about the loan," he said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know what they were here for," she admitted, wrapping her arms around herself. "They were here to see who else was on the land," he said, his voice low and hard. "They were here to see if you were still alone." He looked at her, his eyes intense. "You cannot stay here by yourself. Clara May." The use of her full name startled her. He had never used it before. "This is my home," she said, her voice rising with a defensive anger. "I'm not leaving." "I'm not telling you to leave," he said patiently, as if explaining something to a child. "I'm telling you that you are in danger. Men like that, they don't make friendly visits. They were sizing you up, sizing up the property." He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "You need a man on this land, not for love, for protection." The word struck her like a slap. All her grief, her fear, her humiliation at the hands of the town and her father-in-law, her desperate struggle to survive. It all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of fury. "A man?" she spat, her voice shaking with rage. "I had a man. I had a husband who was supposed to protect me, and he ended up face down in a creek with a bullet in his back. I don't need another man to fail me. I don't need anyone." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, even as she said it. She turned on her heel and stormed into the cabin, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. She leaned against it, her body trembling, her angry tears blurring the room into a watery haze. She hated him for being right. She hated him for seeing her weakness, the very weakness she was trying so desperately to deny. That night, the cold was deeper than ever. It seeped through the chinks in the cabin walls and settled in her bones, but it was no match for the coldness of her fear. The faces of Boone and Cutter swam in her mind's eye. The veiled threats from Davies echoed in her ears. The truth of Elias's words settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She was alone. She was vulnerable, and they would be back. She could not stay in the cabin. The walls felt like they were closing in, pulling on her coat. She slipped outside. The air was sharp and clean, and the snow crunched under her boots. A pale moon hung in the sky, illuminating the world in shades of silver and black. She found herself standing in front of the barn, its dark, hulking shape a silent witness to her turmoil. She could see a faint sliver of light from a lantern shining through a crack in the door. He was in there, a man she barely knew, a man who carried his own ghosts. A sob caught in her throat. She pressed her forehead against the rough, cold wood of the barn door, the splinters digging into her skin. The tears came again, not the wild storm of before, but a quiet, hopeless weeping. She was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of being strong, tired of being alone. "Elias," she whispered, her voice a broken thing. The name was a prayer, a surrender. "Elias." The door creaked open. He stood there, silhouetted by the lantern light behind him. He wore only his trousers and a thin undershirt, and he looked as if he had not been sleeping. He saw her, saw the tears tracking paths down her frozen cheeks, and his guarded expression softened into something akin to pain. He said nothing. He simply stepped aside and held the door open. She stumbled inside, into the relative warmth of the barn. It smelled of hay and horse and him. He closed the door, shutting out the cold and the night. He reached out, not to touch her, but just held his hands up as if to steady her. She fell into him, her arms wrapped around his waist, and she buried her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. He was solid and warm, a living anchor in her swirling chaos. After a moment's hesitation, His arms came around her, holding her gently, protectively. He held her as she cried out all her fear and loneliness, his hand stroking her hair in a gesture of simple, human comfort. When her sobs finally subsided, she was left trembling in his arms. She tilted her head back to look at him. His face was etched with a sorrow that mirrored her own. In his eyes, she saw not a stranger, but a fellow survivor. It was too much. Her grief, her desperation, her profound need for warmth, for life, for something other than the cold touch of memory. It all surged through her. She rose on her toes and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a desperate, hungry claiming. It was the kiss of a drowning woman. She poured all her pain, all her grief, all her fear into it. For a stunning second, he kissed her back, his lips hard against hers, a shared desperation passing between them. Then, with a ragged gasp, he tore himself away. He was trembling, his breathing harsh in the quiet barn. He backed away a step, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Don't!" he rasped, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He stared at her, his eyes full of anguish. "Don't make me replace a dead man." The words should have stopped her. They should have filled her with shame. But she was past shame. She was in a place far beyond pride or propriety. She saw the battle in his eyes, the conflict between his own broken code of honor and the undeniable pull between them. She took a step toward him, her eyes never leaving his. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out a trembling hand and slid her cold fingers beneath the hem of his shirt, pressing her palm against the bare, warm skin of his stomach. He flinched at her touch, a sharp intake of breath, but he did not pull away. He did not stop her. He just stood there, frozen, as her touch spread warmth through the both of them. A silent answer to his plea, a silent declaration of her need. The light of morning was a pale, merciless thing. It crept into the barn and found them, not together, but on opposite sides of the dusty space, separated by a chasm of regret. Clara had woken up in a pile of hay. A coarse blanket Elias must have put over her draped across her shoulders. He was already awake, standing by the barn door, staring out at the stark, white landscape. The air was thick with the things they could not say. Shame coiled in Clara's belly, hot and sharp. Last night had been a moment of madness, a desperate grasping for warmth in the face of an overwhelming chill. Now, in the cold light of day, it just felt sordid. She rose, brushing hay from her hair and dress. Avoiding his gaze, he heard the rustling and turned. His face was a mask of exhaustion, his haunted eyes shadowed with a new kind of pain. "I should go," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. It was a statement of what he believed was right, what the rules of a world he understood demanded. Clara's throat was too tight to speak. He was offering her an escape, a chance to erase the mistake, to pretend it had never happened. Part of her, the part that still answered to the name of Thomas Whitlock's wife, screamed at her to accept it. Let him go. Let the silence and the solitude return. It was a familiar pain, at least, but the thought of him riding away, of that quiet, solid presence vanishing over the horizon, sent a fresh wave of panic through her, colder and more terrifying than the shame. She could not bear to be that alone again. She looked at the floor, at a crack in the frozen earth, at anything but him. She could not force the words out, neither the ones to make him stay nor the ones to send him away. So she just gave a single, sharp nod. It was an ambiguous, cowardly gesture that meant everything and nothing. It was an acknowledgement of his offer, a confession of her own confusion. He took it as the dismissal it appeared to be. He turned without another word and began gathering his meager belonging, a bedroll, a small leather satchel. Clara stood frozen, watching him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had done it. She had sent him away. But the land, it seemed, had other plans, As Elias saddled his horse, the sky, which had been a flat, indifferent gray, began to darken with an alarming speed. A low, ominous moan started in the distance, the sound of wind gathering its strength over miles of open prairie. The temperature dropped. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric tension. "Storm's coming," Elias said, his voice flat as he glanced at the bruised-looking clouds massing on the western horizon. A bad one. It hit them less than an hour later. The world outside the cabin dissolved into a blinding, horizontal chaos of wind and snow. It was not a gentle snowfall, but a furious, violent blizzard that threw itself against the small cabin with the force of a physical blow. The wind shrieked like a banshee, clawing at the roof and rattling the door in its frame. Drifts began to pile up against the walls, sealing them in. Leaving was no longer an option. It would be suicide. Elias remained. He brought his horse into the relative shelter of the barn and then came inside the cabin, stamping the snow from his boots, his presence filling the small space. They were trapped together in an intimacy that was both excruciating and unavoidable. The days that followed were a long, drawn-out study in tension. Their relationship, if it could be called that, was a fragile, undefined thing, a space between them filled with stolen glances and unspoken ache. They moved around each other with a careful, deliberate choreography, their bodies acutely aware of each other's proximity in the cramped cabin. A brush of his arm against hers as they passed by the stove sent a jolt through her. The sight of his hands, large and capable, as he mended a piece of her harness, made her breath catch in her throat. They spoke only when necessary, their conversations limited to the practicalities of their confinement. "The wood is running low. I'll fetch some from the porch." "There's stew on the stove." "Thank you." Each word was a carefully chosen stone dropped into a deep well of silence. In the evenings, he would sit by the fire, his gaze lost in the flames, his face a landscape of sorrows she could only guess at. She would watch him from the other side of the room, a terrible ache in her chest. She saw the weariness in the line of his shoulders, the deep-etched lines of pain around his eyes. She wanted to go to him, to touch him, to offer some small comfort, but the memory of that desperate night in the barn stood between them like a wall of ice. He was a man replacing a dead man, and the guilt of it was a poison in her veins. On the third day of the storm, the wind finally lessened its assault, though the snow continued to fall in thick, silent curtains. The cabin felt claustrophobic, the air stale with their shared silence. Needing to do something? Anything. Clara decided to sort through the last of Thomas's belonging, a task she had been putting off for weeks. She knelt by the large wooden chest at the foot of their bed, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid. The scent of him rose up to meet her, wool and leather and the faint, familiar smell of the man she had married. She pulled out his shirts, folding them into a neat pile, his spare trousers, a worn Bible with his family's names inscribed inside. At the very bottom of the chest was a space where he had kept his heavy winter coat, the one he had been wearing the day he died, but the space was empty. She frowned, a prickle of unease crawling up her spine. She had taken the coat off his body herself. She remembered the terrible weight of it, the dark, stiff stain on the back. She had folded it and put it away, right here. She was sure of it. Her eyes scanned the small room, searching. Perhaps in her grief she had moved it. Her gaze fell on a loose floorboard near the hearth, one that had always been slightly warped. On a strange impulse, she went to it, prying at the edge with her fingernails. It came up with a low groan of protesting wood. The smell hit her first, a coppery, rotten odor that made her stomach turn. She peered into the dark space beneath the floor, and she saw it. Coiled like a dead thing in the darkness was Thomas's coat. It was caked with dirt and stiff with dried blood, far more than she remembered. It looked as though it had been soaked in it. A strangled cry escaped her lips. This was wrong. This was all wrong. She never put it there. She would never hide it away like some shameful secret under the floor. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of the impossible. The room began to spin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. She could not breathe. The walls of the cabin seemed to be pressing in on her, suffocating her. The smell of blood was everywhere, filling her nose, her mouth, her lungs. She scrambled backward, away from the hole in the floor, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. She was having an attack, her mind screaming in silent terror, her body betraying her. Elias was across the room in an instant. He saw her, pale and shaking, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond simple grief. He followed her gaze to the open floorboard and the dark, stained bundle within. His face hardened, his eyes narrowing with a sudden, sharp understanding. "Clara," he said, his voice low and calm, cutting through the fog of her panic. "Breathe. Look at me. Breathe with me." He knelt in front of her, not touching her, but holding her with the force of his gaze. He took a slow, deep breath, and then another. She tried to follow his lead, her own breath still shallow and shaky, but the rhythm of his breathing began to anchor her, pulling her back from the edge of hysteria. "I didn't put it there," she whispered, the words tumbling out. "Elias, I swear, I never put it there." "I know," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. When she was calmer, he rose and went to the hole in the floor. He did not touch the coat. He just looked at it, his expression grim. Then he began to move through the cabin, his earlier listlessness replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He checked the lock on the door. He ran his fingers along the frames of the two small windows. He was not looking for anything broken. He was looking for what was not. "There are no signs of a forced entry," he said, his back to her. "The lock is old, but it hasn't been tampered with. The windows are sealed shut by the ice." He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a terrible certainty. Someone was in this house. Clara, someone with a key, or someone who was let in. They were in here after the funeral. They came back and hid that coat. The blood drained from her face. The idea was a profound violation, a trespass on her grief and her home that was almost worse than the discovery itself. Someone had been in her house, walking on her floors, breathing her air, hiding a piece of her husband's murder right beneath her feet. "But why?" she cried, wrapping her arms around her shaking body. "Why would anyone do that?" "To hide it," he said simply, "to make sure it was never found. Maybe they were looking for something else and had to put it somewhere quick." The foundation of her grief began to crack. She had mourned Thomas's death as a senseless tragedy, a random act of violence in a violent land. But this was different. This was deliberate. This was calculated. The bullet in his back, the lack of investigation, the banker's sudden interest in her land, the whispers of gold. And now this. They were not separate events. They were pieces of a puzzle she was only now beginning to see. "He wasn't just killed," she said, the realization dawning on her with a sickening clarity. "He was murdered, over something he knew, something I don't." She looked at Elias, her eyes pleading for an answer he did not have. "Who would do this? Who?" Before he could answer, a loud, insistent banging on the cabin door made them both jump. It was the first visitor they'd had since the storm began. Elias moved instinctively in front of Clara, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Who is it?" he called out. "Sheriff Brody," a gruff voice replied. "Open up, Mrs. Whitlock, I know you're in there." Clara exchanged a bewildered look with Elias. The sheriff. Maybe he was here to help. Maybe he had found something, learned something. A desperate flicker of hope ignited within her. Elias opened the door to reveal a large, red-faced man shaking snow from a thick buffalo coat. His gaze fell on Clara, then shifted to Elias, lingering for a moment with open suspicion. "Sheriff," Clara said, her voice unsteady. "Thank you for coming. Something has happened. I found something." "I'm not here about that business. Ma'am," the sheriff interrupted, cutting her off. He pulled a ledger from inside his coat. "I'm here because the county tax roll is due. You're 2 months behind. Mrs. Whitlock. The storm broke enough for me to make my rounds, and your homestead was first on my list." Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. Taxes. He had ridden through a blizzard to talk to her about taxes. "But my husband," she stammered. "He was murdered, and I just found evidence. Someone hid his bloody coat under my floor." Sheriff Brody sighed, an impatient, put-upon sound. "Ma'am, as I recall, the finding was a hunting accident. As for the coat, you've been through a trauma. Grief does funny things to a person's memory. You probably put it there yourself and forgot." He tapped the ledger with a thick finger. "Now, about this delinquency." Elias stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not make a single threatening move, but a cold, quiet authority radiated from him that made the sheriff take an involuntary step back. "She'll pay when she can," Elias said, his voice flat. "You can leave now." The sheriff puffed out his chest, his face turning a shade redder. "And who in the hell are you?" "I'm the man helping her," Elias said, his eyes like chips of flint. "And I'm telling you to get off this land before you find yourself walking back to town." The two men stared at each other for a long, silent moment. The sheriff, for all his bluster, was a man of town laws and paperwork. Elias was something else entirely, something forged in the harder, more unforgiving parts of the West. The sheriff was the first to break eye contact. He grumbled something under his breath, snapped his ledger shut, and turned, wading back through the snow to his horse without another word. Elias closed the door, the flimsy lock clicking into place. It was a useless gesture. The law was not a locked door. It was a phantom. It meant nothing out here. The only law was what a man could enforce with his own 2 hands. He looked at Clara, and in his eyes, she saw the death of her last, foolish hope for justice. They were utterly, completely on their own. That night, the storm returned with a final, dying fury. They sat by the fire, the howling wind a mournful chorus to their thoughts. The bloody coat was gone, burned in the stove until nothing but ash and a foul smell remained. But its ghost lingered in the room. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer awkward or resentful. It was a shared space, a recognition of their common enemy, both the men who threatened them and the ghosts that haunted them. Clara watched Elias stare into the flames, and she saw the weight he carried, the nightmare she had heard him cry out from in the barn. "Sarah," she said softly. His head snapped up, his body going rigid. The name, spoken aloud in this quiet space, had the force of a gunshot. "You heard me," he said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. "I hear your nightmares sometimes." He looked away, back into the fire, his jaw tight. She thought he would shut her out, retreat back into his fortress of silence. But instead, he began to speak, his voice low and rough with memory. "She was a farmer's daughter, down in the Texas Panhandle. Her family took me in one season when I was drifting, gave me a job, a place to stay. They were good people." He paused, and the fire crackled in the silence. "Sarah, she was kind. She saw something in me that wasn't broken." He fell silent for so long that Clara thought he was finished, but then he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "There was a raid, Comancheros. I was away on a supply run to a town 2 days' ride south. I was supposed to be there to protect them. That was my job. But I wasn't." He closed his eyes, and she could almost see the images playing out behind them. "When I got back, it was all just smoke and blood. They were all gone. I found her out by the creek." His voice broke, a raw, ragged sound of old grief. "I never got there in time. I buried her with my hands. There was no shovel left to find." The confession hung in the air, a story of failure and guilt so profound it made the room feel colder. He had failed to protect his Sarah, Just as Clara felt she had failed to protect her Thomas, his ghosts were no different from hers. They were just older, their edges worn smooth by years of lonely grief. She moved from her chair and knelt on the hearth beside him. He did not look at her, but he knew she was there. She reached out a hesitant hand and gently touched his arm. He flinched, but he did not pull away. "You're here now," she whispered, her voice thick with tears for him, for her, for both of their lost souls. She moved her hand to his face, her thumb stroking the rough line of his jaw. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes shimmering with an unspeakable pain. "You made it this time," she said. It was an absolution. It was a release. A great, shuddering breath escaped his lips, and he leaned into her touch, a weary soldier finally laying down his arms. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair, and she held him, her own grief momentarily forgotten in the face of his. Later, in the quiet darkness of the cabin, with the storm still raging outside, she went to him. There was no desperation this time, no frantic, hungry need. She reached for him gently, a quiet offering. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Their coming together was slow and raw, a tender exploration of shared wounds. It was full of a quiet, desperate sadness, an acknowledgement of all they had lost. Every touch was a question, every kiss an answer. She traced the old scars on his back, and he stroked the tear tracks on her cheeks. He moved with an infinite gentleness, as if she were made of glass. It was a communion of two broken souls, seeking not passion but solace. Halfway through, a sob broke from Clara's lips, a final, wrenching release of her grief for Thomas. She wept, not in his arms, but with him. He did not stop. He did not pull away. He simply held her tighter, his body shielding her from the storm inside and out, his own silent tears mingling with hers in the darkness. He held her through the long, dark night, a quiet promise that she would not have to face the morning alone. When the great storm finally broke, it felt as though the world was being born anew, scrubbed clean and silent under a blanket of pristine snow. The thaw that followed was a messy, sluggish affair, turning the pristine landscape into a treacherous mire of mud and slush. The isolation that the blizzard had enforced was over. With the trail to town once again passable, the need for supplies became urgent. The fragile, storm-forged intimacy between Clara and Elias had to face the outside world, and the outside world was a place of judgment. The rumors began the first time they rode into redemption together. Clara had insisted on it, her fear of being alone now greater than her fear of what people might say. They rode in the farm wagon, Elias handling the reins, his quiet presence beside her a solid, reassuring weight. But in town, that weight shifted, becoming a mark against her. The whispers were no longer just about how her husband had died. They were now about the living man who sat beside his widow. They started in the general store, a rustle of calico and condemnation from a group of women near the bolt of fabric. Clara, her head held high, pretended not to hear as she traded for flour, coffee, and salt. But the words followed her, sharp as needles. Barely a season in the ground, and she's already replaced him. With a hired drifter, no less. Look at him. Has the look of a man who's seen the inside of a jail. No shame. Some women have no shame at all. The store owner, a man who had once offered Thomas credit with a friendly smile, now counted her coins with a dour expression, his eyes refusing to meet hers. The transaction was cold, purely business. The warmth of community had frozen over. It was worse on Sunday, driven by a lifetime of habit and a desperate need for some semblance of normalcy. Clara went to church. Elias did not accompany her, seeming to understand that his presence would only make it harder. He stayed back at the ranch, offering only a quiet nod as she left. She walked into the small wooden chapel, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The sermon was on the sins of the flesh. Reverend Michael's eyes seemed to find hers again and again as he thundered on about temptation and moral decay. After the service, the women who had once shared recipes and gossip with her gathered their skirts and turned away as she approached. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, gave her a look of such frigid disapproval that it was more painful than a slap. They refused to speak to her. She was an outcast, her grief tainted by the scandal of her survival. She left before the final hymn, her face burning with humiliation, the loneliness more profound in that crowded room than it had ever been on the isolated ranch. The breaking point came the following week. They needed feed for the remaining livestock, and the only place to get it was the livery stable, a place that doubled as an unofficial town saloon. Clara waited in the wagon while Elias went inside to negotiate. Through the open doorway, she could hear the low murmur of men's voices, the clink of glasses, and then one voice, loud and slurred with whiskey, rose above the others. "Well, look what we got here. Granger, ain't it? Heard you're keeping the pretty little widow Whitlock warm these nights. Must be a soft posting after a hard life." Clara's blood ran cold. It was Jed, a local ranch hand known for his cruel tongue and heavy hand. Elias's voice was low, devoid of emotion. "That's no way to speak of a grieving woman." Jed let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Grieving? Is that what she's doing? Looks to me like she's a whore mourning for two, one in the ground and one in her bed." The world seemed to stop. The insult, so vile and public, hung in the dusty air. Before anyone could react, there was a sickening crunch of bone on bone. Elias had moved faster than Clara could have imagined, crossing the room in 2 long strides and driving his fist directly into Jed's sneering mouth. The man staggered back, spitting a tooth and a stream of blood onto the dirty floorboards. He roared with rage and lunged, and the 2 men went down in a chaotic tangle of flailing limbs and guttural curses. Clara leaped from the wagon, her heart in her throat. Other men in the saloon, after a moment of stunned silence, moved to pull them apart. By the time they dragged Elias off the bloodied and groaning Jed, the damage was done. Elias's lip was split, and a dark bruise was already forming under his eye. He cradled his right hand against his chest, his knuckles swollen and unnaturally angled. Jed was a mess, his nose clearly broken, his face a mask of blood and fury. "You'll hang for this, drifter," Jed sputtered through a mouthful of blood. "Get out of my town," the livery owner snarled at Elias, pointing a trembling finger at the door. Elias said nothing. He gave Clara a single, hard look, and she understood. They left, the bags of feed forgotten. The ride back to the ranch was silent, but the silence was different this time. It was filled with the metallic taste of violence and the grim reality of what he had done for her. He had defended her honor at the cost of his own peace. Back in the cabin, she made him sit, her hands shaking as she fetched the basin of water and the bottle of carbolic acid. She cleaned the cut on his lip, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He winced but did not pull away. When she reached for his injured hand, he resisted for a moment, his pride a palpable thing. "Let me see," she insisted, her voice soft but firm. He relented, letting her take his hand in hers. It was worse than she thought. The bones were broken. She could feel them grate beneath the skin. It would need to be set, and they were a day's ride from the nearest doctor. "It's broken," she stated, her voice thick. "Elias, you shouldn't have—" He finally looked at her, his dark eyes burning with an intensity that stole her breath. "No man gets to say that about you." She set about splinting his hand as best she could, using strips of clean linen and pieces of a wooden crate. He sat stoically through the painful process, his jaw tight. When she was finished, he was effectively one-handed, a new and frustrating vulnerability for a man so defined by his capability. He had traded a piece of his strength for her name. A few nights later, a new and more insidious fear made itself known. Clara was banking the fire for the night when she saw it, a flicker of movement out by the line of pine trees at the edge of the clearing. She froze, her eyes straining in the moonlight. It was a man, a tall figure in a dark coat, standing partially hidden in the shadows, watching the cabin. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air washed over her.
"Elias,"
she whispered, her voice tight with alarm. He was by her side in an instant, his good hand resting on the pistol at his belt. He saw the figure at the same moment she did. The man, as if sensing he'd been seen, melted back into the deeper shadows of the forest. Without a word, Elias was out the door. He moved with a startling, silent speed despite his limp, disappearing into the darkness. Clara waited, her heart pounding against her ribs, her gaze fixed on the spot where the man had been. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, Elias returned, his breath pluming in the cold air, his face grim.
"He's gone,"
he said. His trail vanished in the rocks up on the ridge. He knows the land, or he got lucky. The watcher did not return, but his presence lingered, a constant, unseen threat. The ranch no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a trap. The world was shrinking, the walls of danger closing in around them. Driven by a desperate need to understand the secret that had cost Thomas his life, Clara began to go through his things again, this time with a frantic, searching energy. She was not just packing away memories. She was hunting for clues. She reread his letters, looked through his account books, but found nothing but the mundane records of a failing rancher. Finally, she picked up his personal journal. It was a small, leather-bound book he had carried with him everywhere. She had avoided it, feeling as though reading it would be a final, painful intrusion. Now, she opened it, her fingers tracing his familiar, looping script. The early entries were full of hope, of his love for her and his dreams for their land. But as she read on, the entries became shorter, more sporadic. The words grew darker, filled with a paranoia she now recognized. He wrote of being watched, of deals gone sour, of men in town he no longer trusted. Tucked into a small leather pocket on the inside back cover, her fingers brushed against something stiff. It was a piece of parchment, folded into a small, tight square. She carefully unfolded it. It was a map, hand-drawn in faded ink. It was a rough sketch of their property, detailing the creek, the ridge, and the stand of pines. But there was another marking, an X, in a small, boxed-off section of the hills to the north, on land that bordered theirs, with a series of strange symbols and numbers written beside it.
"Elias,"
she called, her voice trembling.
"Come look at this."
He came over to the table where she had spread the map out under the lantern light. He leaned over it, his brow furrowed in concentration. He studied it for a long time, his good hand tracing the lines on the parchment. "I've seen markings like this before," he said slowly, his voice a low rumble. "Down in the mining camps in Colorado." He tapped the strange symbols with his finger. "This isn't a map for gold. The geological formations aren't right for it around here. This is a reference for a vein of silver." The word hung in the air. Silver. It was the answer to everything. The banker and his menacing companions. Boone's comment about gold in the hills. A deliberate misdirection. The sheriff's disinterest. The watcher in the dark. Thomas hadn't stumbled onto a hunting accident. He had stumbled onto a fortune, and it had gotten him killed.
"He found it,"
Clara whispered, a wave of nausea washing over her. "And they killed him for it." "They killed him for the claim," Elias corrected her, his voice grim. "Or for the map to it. And now they think you have it." His eyes met hers, and in them, she saw the stark, unvarnished truth of their situation. "They will not stop until they get it. Clara, Davies, Boone, Cutter. They will tear this place apart to find it. They will tear you apart." The terror was a living thing inside her, cold and suffocating. She looked around the small cabin, at the life she had fought so hard to hold together. It was all about to be ripped away. And then she looked at Elias. He was her only shield, her only hope. The thought of him leaving, of facing what was coming alone. was more terrifying than death itself. A primal fear, sharp and overwhelming, seized her. She grabbed the front of his shirt, her knuckles white. "You cannot go," she said, her voice a ragged, desperate plea. "Elias, you cannot leave me." "Clara," he began, his voice gentle, but she cut him off, her words tumbling out in a frantic, broken torrent. "No, you don't understand. If you leave, I'll stop eating. I'll stop breathing. I swear to God, I will just lie down and let them come for me. I can't live through another man walking away from me. I can't." Tears streamed down her face, hot and unchecked. She was not just a widow anymore. She was a woman on the edge of an abyss, clinging to her only handhold. He looked down at her tear-streaked face and the fierce, desperate grip she had on him. And something in his guarded expression broke. The ghosts of his past, of the woman he had failed to save, warred with his instinct to run, to drift, to never put down roots in a place that could be taken from him. And this time, the ghosts lost. He covered her hands with his good one, his calloused thumb stroking her skin. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and fierce, a vow spoken in the heart of the storm. "You will never be alone on this land again. I promise you." The tension drained out of her, replaced by a wave of relief so profound it left her weak. He stayed there for a long moment, their breaths mingling, a silent pact forged between them. Then, he lifted his head and led her outside, into the cold night air. A light snow had begun to fall, the flakes drifting down like soft, white whispers, blanketing the wounded land. He turned her to face him, his dark eyes searching hers in the pale moonlight. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperation or shared grief. It was a kiss of choice, of promise. It was slow and deep and sure. Her hands, no longer clinging in fear, moved up to his hair, her fingers twining in the thick strands. His body shielded her from the cold, his arms a fortress around her. And for the first time, as he deepened the kiss, a soft, broken moan escaped her lips. A sound that was not a memory of a dead man, but a prayer for the one who was holding her. His name, Elias. Later, back inside the warmth of the cabin, a profound peace settled between them. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The threats outside were still real, still waiting, but for this one night, they held them at bay. Elias took her hand, his good one, and drew her into the center of the room. There was no music. There was no need for it. He placed his splinted hand on her waist, and she rested her head against his chest. They danced, a slow, shuffling circle in the firelight. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs in the stove, the soft whisper of their boots on the wooden floor, and their own quiet breathing, perfectly in sync. It was a dance of survivors, a silent celebration of the simple, miraculous fact that they were both still standing, and that they were, for now, standing together. It was more intimate than any touch, more eloquent than any words. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated peace. But outside, in the darkness beyond the window pane, the peace was an illusion. A figure stood concealed in the shadows, his cold eyes fixed on the two dancing silhouettes. He watched them, his face a mask of bitter resentment. He reached into his coat pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He pulled out a match, and in the deep, profound dark, a single, sulphurous flare was struck, the tiny flame a harbinger of the fire to come. The peace of the new dawn was a fragile, crystalline thing. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara had slept without dreams of ghosts. She woke to the warmth of Elias beside her, his steady breathing a quiet rhythm in the stillness of the cabin. A pale, rosy light was just beginning to touch the snow-covered world outside. In that one, perfect moment, the threats of the world, The whispers, the debts, the unseen watchers felt distant and powerless. There was only the warmth of the fire, the quiet breathing of the man beside her, and the promise of a day that might not be defined by fear. Then she smelled it. A thin, acrid scent snaking through the chinks in the cabin walls. It was the smell of wood smoke, but it was wrong. It was too sharp, too greedy. It was the smell of something devouring, not warming. Elias was awake in an instant, his body tensing beside her. He was already moving before she could form a word, swinging his legs out of the bed, his face a grim mask in the dim light. He threw open the cabin door, and the world outside was hell. The barn was a roaring inferno, a monstrous blossom of orange and red against the soft pink of the dawn sky. Flames clawed at the roof, sending a geyser of black smoke and incandescent embers into the air. The crackle and roar of the blaze was a living sound, a hungry beast devouring their world beam by beam. The heat washed over them, a physical blow even from the porch. Clara's mind went blank with horror. The barn, their winter stores of hay and feed, the tools, the milk cow, Elias's horse. Their entire future was inside that roaring furnace. Panic gave way to a frantic, useless energy. She saw that the gate to the small livestock pen beside the barn had been thrown open, the simple leather hinge sliced through with a knife. Their few chickens were scattered, squawking in terror, but the cow was gone, likely having fled into the wilderness. "Daisy!" Elias's horse, a sturdy buckskin mare, let out a terrified, high-pitched scream from within the inferno. The sound cut through Clara like a knife. "No!" Elias roared, his voice raw with anguish. Before Clara could stop him, he was running, a desperate, limping sprint toward the wall of flame. "Elias, don't! It's too late!" she screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the fire. He ignored her, ripping a wet cloth from the water barrel and tying it around his face with his good hand. He plunged into the churning smoke at the side of the barn, kicking at the weakened side door that led to the stalls. The wood splintered, and he disappeared into the maelstrom. Clara was frozen for a heartbeat, paralyzed by a terror so profound it stole the air from her lungs. Then, a primal instinct for survival, for defiance, took over. She would not just stand here and watch everything burn. She grabbed the 2 buckets by the well and began a frantic, hopeless battle against the blaze. She worked the pump with a desperate strength she did not know she possessed, filled the buckets, and ran, sloshing icy water toward the flames. The water hissed into steam a foot from the fire, a pathetic offering against the inferno's rage. Her lungs burned, raw from the smoke and the freezing air. Her eyes streamed, blinded by the acrid fumes and her own tears. She was a tiny, defiant figure against an apocalyptic backdrop, her efforts laughably futile. But she could not stop. She pumped, she ran, she threw, over and over again, a frantic automaton driven by pure will. An eternity later, a dark shape staggered out of the smoke. It was Elias, leading the terrified horse. The mare's coat was singed, her eyes rolling wildly, but she was alive. Elias himself was a wreck. His eyebrows were gone, his face blackened with soot. He had thrown his own coat over the horse's head to shield her from the worst of the flames. He led her a safe distance away and tied her to a post, speaking to her in low, calming tones, his voice a hoarse rasp. Clara dropped the buckets and ran to him. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, but then she saw his hands. The splint on his right hand was a charred, smoking ruin. He had ripped it off inside the barn. Both his hands were a raw, angry red, blistered and seared from the heat. The pain must have been excruciating, but his face was a stoic mask. There was nothing more they could do. They stood together, helpless, and watched the barn collapse in on itself with a deafening roar, sending a final, massive column of fire and smoke into the morning sky. They had lost nearly everything, most of their winter food, the tools Thomas had inherited from his father, the structure that was the heart of the ranch's operations. They had the cabin, a handful of terrified chickens, one horse, and the clothes on their backs. They were ruined. as the flames died down to a smoldering, blackened skeleton of timbers. The full weight of the loss crashed down on Clara. She sank to her knees in the muddy, ash-strewn snow. A single, dry sob escaped her. Then another. It was not just the barn. It was everything. It was Thomas, dying alone in the cold. It was his father's cruel letter. It was the town's judgment. It was the constant, grinding struggle to survive, only to have the last of her hope devoured by fire. "It's me," she whispered, the words ragged and broken. Then her voice rose to a keening, hysterical scream that tore from the depths of her soul. "It's me. I'm cursed. Everything I touch, everyone who comes near me, dies or is destroyed." She clawed at the frozen ground, her nails filling with dirt and soot. "Thomas is dead because of me, and now you... Look at you. Look at what this place has done to you. Every man near me is doomed." She was sobbing on the ground, a wild, grief-stricken creature, lost in a despair so complete it bordered on madness. A shadow fell over her. Elias knelt behind her, his movements slow and pained. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. She struggled for a moment, wanting to be left alone in her misery, but he held on. His grip was surprisingly strong. She could feel the heat radiating from his burned hands through the thin fabric of her dress, a searing reminder of what he had just done. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his soot-stained cheek against her hair. "I'm not dead yet," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly promise in her ear. The simple words, spoken with such quiet, unyielding certainty, cut through her hysteria. He was not dead. He was burned and bruised and half-crippled, but he was here. He was holding her. She leaned back against him, her wild sobs subsiding into a long, shuddering sigh of exhaustion and defeat. They stayed like that for a long time, two survivors huddled together in the ruins of their world, the smoke stinging their eyes. When they finally found the strength to move, to assess the full scope of the damage, they saw the note. It was nailed to the door of the chicken coop, the one small structure that had been spared the flames. A single piece of cheap paper, held in place by a bent nail, the words scrawled in a crude, aggressive hand. "This land don't belong to you." Clara stared at it, the threat a cold knot of dread in her stomach. It was a confirmation of everything they had suspected. This was not a random act. This was a message, written in fire and ash. Elias, however, was not looking at the words. He was staring at the handwriting, his face, already grim, darkened into something Clara had never seen before. It was a look of cold, hard recognition, a dredging up of a past he had tried to bury. "I know this hand," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. He reached out with his less injured hand and ripped the note from the door. "Boone." "Boone?" Clara repeated, the name familiar from the banker's visit. "The man who was with Davies." Elias nodded, his eyes fixed on the crude lettering. "I knew him, a long time ago. We rode together for a spell, with a gang down near the Cimarron. He wasn't the smartest, but he was mean, and he was always talking about silver. He was obsessed with it, believed it was his ticket to a life where he didn't have to work. He'd kill his own mother for an easy score." He crumpled the note in his fist. "He must have drifted up here, fell in with Davies. He was the watcher in the woods. I'd bet my life on it." The knowledge that their enemy had a name, a face, did not bring comfort. It made the threat more real, more personal. This man, Boone, had watched them, had set fire to their home, and would surely be back to finish the job. Clara looked at the smoldering ruins, at Elias's burned hands, at the bleak, empty future stretching out before them. The fear and grief inside her curdled into something else, something hard and sharp and hot, rage, a pure, undiluted fury. She turned to Elias, her eyes blazing. "Then you have to kill him," she said, her voice low and trembling with intensity.
You have to find him and kill him before he kills us.
Elias looked at her, and for the first time, he looked away, his gaze falling to the ruined barn.
Clara.
No, she insisted, grabbing his arm, oblivious to the pain it must have caused him. He will not stop. You said it yourself. Men like him do not stop. He burned our home. He wants me dead. He wants this land. Are you going to wait for him to come here and put a bullet in my back too, like Thomas? She was pleading, her voice rising with a desperate, frantic energy. You have to be the one to stop him. For me, for us, you have to kill him. A look of profound weariness settled over Elias's features, a pain that went deeper than his physical burns. He gently removed her hand from his arm. I have killed men, Clara, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his past. I've done it to survive. I've done it when I had no other choice, but to go out and hunt a man down in cold blood, to become the thing I've spent years trying to outrun. He shook his head, his eyes filled with a deep, soul-wrenching sorrow. I kill him. I lose what's left of my soul. There are some lines that, once you cross them, you can never go back. His refusal was a physical blow. She saw it not as a moral stand, but as a failure, a choice to preserve his own soul at the cost of her life. She turned away from him, a bitter, angry silence falling between them. But Elias had not refused to act. He had only refused to become a murderer. That night, as Clara sat numbly by the stove, he began to prepare. He cleaned his pistol with his one good hand, his movements slow and deliberate. He packed a small satchel with what little jerky they had left and a canteen of water. He was not hunting. He was going to confront a threat. He was going to draw the fight away from her, away from the ranch. When he was ready, he came to her. I'm going out, he said quietly. I'll find his trail. I'm going to end this. She did not look at him. She just stared into the fire, her heart a cold, hard knot in her chest. Clara, he said, his voice softer. He reached out and touched her shoulder. She flinched away from him. He sighed, a sound of deep regret, and then he was gone. The soft click of the cabin door closing behind him was the loudest sound she had ever heard. She was alone again. The night stretched on, an eternity of darkness and fear. She could not sleep. She could not rest. She found herself at the old wooden chest, the one where she had first found the empty space where Thomas's coat should have been. The coat was still there, under the floorboards. She hadn't had the heart to move it after the sheriff's visit. Now, she pulled up the board and lifted it out. The smell of old blood and earth filled the small cabin. It was a tangible piece of her grief, a shroud she had been unable to let go of. She sank into the rocking chair by the hearth, pulling the heavy, stiff coat over her lap. She rocked back and forth, the rhythmic creak of the chair a lonely counterpoint to the silence. She prayed, desperate, incoherent prayers to a God she was no longer sure she believed in. She prayed for Elias's safety, for his return. She rocked her dead husband's coat in her arms like a ghost, a woman caught between two men, one lost to death and the other lost to the violent wilderness. Miles away, Elias tracked a ghost of his own. Boone had been careless, arrogant. He had left a clear trail leading away from the ranch, heading north into the rocky, timbered hills. Elias followed, his mare picking her way carefully through the darkness. He was not a hunter, but he knew how to track. He knew how to move silently. He was heading into a confrontation he did not want, a battle for a soul that was not his own. The ambush came 2 days later, near a narrow pass choked with snow and boulders. Elias had grown weary, his burned hands a constant, throbbing agony. A moment of distraction was all it took. The first shot was a deafening crack that echoed through the canyon, and a fist of white-hot pain slammed into his left shoulder, knocking him from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring the breath from his lungs. The second shot came an instant later, tearing through the flesh of his thigh, a searing, crippling blow. Boone stepped out from behind a massive boulder, a smoking rifle in his hands, a triumphant, ugly grin on his scarred face. Should have stayed away. "Granger," he crowed. "This silver is mine. The girl, the land, it's all mine now." Elias lay in the snow, his vision blurring, the world tilting. Blood was soaking his coat, melting the snow beneath him. He was dying. He thought of Clara, alone in the cabin, waiting for him. He thought of his promise, "You will never be alone again." Boone leveled the rifle for the killing shot, but Elias was not done. With a surge of pure, desperate adrenaline, he drew his pistol. His right hand was a mess of burned flesh and broken bones, but he gripped the gun, his thumb fumbling with the hammer. He fired, the shot going wide as a spasm of agony shot up his arm. The shot was enough. It made Boone flinch, curse, and lower his rifle, deciding to walk over and finish the job up close. It was the mistake Elias had been counting on. As Boone loomed over him, Elias lunged, not with the gun, but with the Bowie knife he kept sheathed at his back. He drove himself up from the ground, ignoring the fire in his leg and shoulder, and plunged the long, heavy blade deep into Boone's throat. The man's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. A horrible gurgling sound escaped his lips. He clawed at the hilt of the knife, his rifle falling from his hands. He staggered back, collapsing into the snow, his life pouring out of him in a torrent of crimson. Elias fell back, his strength gone. He lay there for a long time, the silence of the canyon broken only by his own ragged breathing and the dying twitches of his former associate. He had survived. He had killed Boone, and he felt a piece of his soul turn to ice. The journey home was a waking nightmare. He managed to stop the worst of the bleeding, packing the wounds with snow and strips of his own shirt. He hauled himself back onto his horse, his body a symphony of agony. The world became a blur of pain, snow, and a single, driving thought. Clara. He had to get back to Clara. He rode until he could ride no more, and then he fell. He crawled. He dragged his shattered leg through the snow, his body on fire with fever, leaving a dark, smeared trail behind him. Days bled into one another. He lost track of time. He was driven by a single, desperate promise. He finally saw it through a haze of delirium, the thin plume of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. He had made it. He crawled the last few yards to the porch, his strength finally giving out. He collapsed at the foot of the cabin door. His last conscious act a weak, desperate scratching at the wood. A final plea before the darkness took him completely. The sound was so faint, a barely there scratching at the cabin door, that Clara at first thought it was a branch skittering in the wind. She sat in the rocking chair, the dead man's coat a heavy, cold weight on her lap, her mind a numb landscape of fear. For 3 days and 3 nights, she had been alone, and every sound was a monster, every shadow a threat. The scratching came again, more desperate this time, a weak, frantic scrape of nail or leather against wood. It was not the wind. A terror, cold and sharp, shot through her. Boone. He had come back to finish it. She grabbed the Winchester from its place by the hearth, her movement stiff and clumsy from exhaustion. She crept to the door, her heart a wild drum against her ribs. She peered through the small peephole Thomas had drilled years ago. All she could see was a dark, unmoving lump at the foot of the door. With a trembling hand, she lifted the bar and pulled the heavy door inward. He did not fall inside. He was already on the ground, a crumpled, broken shape in the snow. Elias, his name was a choked, soundless cry in her throat. He was caked in frozen mud and dried blood, his face a ghastly, pale mask under the moonlight. His buckskin mare stood a few feet away, her reins trailing in the snow, her head hanging low with exhaustion. For a moment, Clara was paralyzed by the sheer, horrific sight of him. Then a fierce, protective energy surged through her, burning away the fear. She would not let him die here, not on her doorstep, Not after everything. Getting him inside was a Herculean task. He was a dead weight, his body limp and unresponsive. She wrapped her arms under his, her boots slipping in the snow as she strained, dragging him backward over the threshold, inch by agonizing inch. His wounded leg left a dark, wet smear on the wooden floor. She managed to get him to the hearth, his head lolling against the rough-hewn planks. She barred the door, her whole body shaking with exertion and adrenaline, and then she fell to her knees beside him. She worked by the flickering light of the fire and a single lantern, her tears falling freely, mingling with the blood and grime she wiped from his skin. The wounds were far worse than she could have imagined. A deep, ragged hole in his shoulder, and another in his thigh, both crusted with blackened blood and already showing the angry red signs of infection. He was burning with fever, his skin hot and dry to the touch. There was no doctor, no help to be had. There was only her. She boiled water, sterilized her sewing needle and thread in the flames of the lantern. She cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his trousers and shirt with trembling hands. She cleaned the wounds as best she could, her stomach churning at the sight of the torn flesh. And then, through a blur of tears that made the needle dance in her vision, she began to sew. She stitched the edges of his skin together, her movements clumsy but determined, praying that she was helping, not harming. He moaned in his delirium, a low, animal sound of pure agony, but he did not wake. For days, the small cabin became a crucible of life and death. Clara did not sleep for more than a few minutes at a time, waking with a start to check his breathing, to lay a cool, wet cloth on his fevered brow. The world shrank to the space around the pallet she had made for him by the fire. He was lost in the fevered wilderness of his own mind, a place far more dangerous than the one he had just crawled out of. In his delirium, he spoke. His words were a broken, muttered litany of his deepest pains. He called out for Sarah, his voice thick with an ancient, unforgiving guilt. And then he would mutter her own name, his voice changing, softening into a plea. "Clara, Clara May," he would rasp, his eyes moving restlessly behind his lids. "I'm sorry, so sorry." "Sorry for what?" she would whisper back, leaning close, wiping the sweat from his face. "The blood," he would murmur. "Should have died, years ago. Should have been me." He was apologizing for the violence he had brought into her life, for the man he had been forced to kill. He was confessing his own death wish, the profound weariness of a soul that had fought for too long. His broken, fevered words revealed the truth of him. He was not a killer by nature, but a man haunted by the killing he had been forced to do. She nursed him with a fierce, unwavering devotion. She cleaned his blood from the floorboards. She dribbled water and thin broth between his cracked lips, praying he would swallow. And she talked to him, in the long, silent hours of the night, with only the crackle of the fire for company. She told him everything. She filled the space between them with the words she had never spoken to anyone. She told him about her childhood, about her dreams of a life bigger than the one she had been born into. She told him about meeting Thomas, about the dizzying, hopeful love of their first year together. Then she told him the things she had been too ashamed to admit even to herself, how Thomas's love had soured, how his silence had become a weapon, how his touch had begun to frighten her. She confessed her own small betrayals, the moments of resentment, the flicker of relief that had mingled with her horror when she first found him dead. She unburdened her soul to the unconscious man, pouring out all her secrets, all her grief and guilt and loneliness, into the quiet, waiting darkness of the sick room. On the fourth day, as Elias's fever raged, Clara knew she had to make a choice. She looked over at the rocking chair where Thomas's coat lay, a dark, silent accusation. She had been rocking it in her arms like a child, clinging to the ghost of a man who was long gone, while a living, breathing man was fighting for his life on her floor. The coat was an anchor, mooring her to a past that was trying to drown her. With a sudden, final resolve, she stood up. She walked to the chair, picked up the heavy, blood-stiffened garment, and carried it to the stove. She did not hesitate. She opened the cast-iron door and shoved it inside, into the heart of the fire. The wool smoldered for a moment, and then it caught, erupting in a sudden, bright flare of orange flame. She watched as the fire consumed it, as the threads of her old life curled, blackened, and turned to weightless, gray ash. The smell of burning wool filled the cabin, a strange, sacrificial incense. She was not just burning a coat. She was burning a ghost. She was letting him go. The next morning, she took the shovel and a piece of scrap wood from the pile of rubble that had been the barn. She walked to the edge of the clearing, near the blackened ruins, and she dug a small hole. She fashioned a simple cross from the wood, lashing it together with a strip of leather. She did not write a name on it. She did not need to. She planted it firmly in the earth, a final, quiet marker for the man she had loved and lost. It was not an act of forgetting, but an act of peace. She was laying her husband to rest, finally, so that she could turn her attention to the living. She walked back into the cabin, a strange lightness in her heart. She knelt beside Elias. His breathing seemed shallower, his skin cooler. Fear clutched at her. She placed a hand on his chest. It rose and fell, rose and fell, and then his eyelids fluttered. They opened, just a crack. His eyes, no longer wild with fever, were cloudy and confused, but they were his. They found her. A slow, weak smile touched his lips. Clara's own lips trembled. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. She smiled back. A wide, watery, brilliant smile of pure, unadulterated relief. He was weak, he was broken, but he was alive. He was going to live. News of the fire, it turned out, traveled faster than a winter storm. A few days later, as Elias was beginning to take sips of broth on his own, a wagon pulled up to the cabin. It was Reverend Michael and his wife. Clara's first instinct was to bar the door, her pride still smarting from their judgment, but they did not stop at a distance. They got out of the wagon, their faces etched with a mixture of concern and shame.
Mrs. Whitlock, Clara May,
the preacher began, holding his hat in his hands.
We heard about the fire. I am sorry for my judgment. For the towns, we were wrong.
Clara stared at him, speechless. Behind them, another wagon was coming up the trail, and then another. It was a small procession of her neighbors, the very people who had shunned her. They had come bearing gifts, sacks of feed, jars of preserves, blankets, tools. They had heard about the fire, and then the whispers had started. Whispers about Boone and Davies, about the sheriff finding Boone's body in the pass, about the quiet drifter who had apparently saved the widow's life at the cost of his own. They saw her, standing on the porch of her small cabin, soot-stained and exhausted, but unbroken. They saw the freshly made cross near the ruins of the barn, and when Elias, pale and gaunt, appeared in the doorway behind her, leaning heavily on the frame for support, they saw the truth. This was not a story of scandal. It was a story of survival. A grudging, hard-won respect began to dawn on their faces. They were a hard people, but they understood courage when they saw it. They began to unload their wagons, the men offering to help clear the rubble, the women offering to help in the cabin. The community she had lost was slowly, cautiously, returning to her. As the last of the snow melted and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the muddy earth, the ranch began to heal. The harshness of winter gave way to the gentle persistence of new life. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine. The frozen silence of the landscape was replaced by the song of returning birds. Elias, too, began to heal. His strength returned slowly, his limp more pronounced, his burned hands scarred and stiff, but he was whole. The haunted look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a quiet, watchful peace. He and Clara fell into a new rhythm, one of easy companionship. One afternoon, they were sitting on the porch steps, the warm spring sun on their faces. Elias had been quiet for a long time, watching her. "Do you still miss him?" he asked, his voice low. The question did not surprise her. She knew it was one he had to ask, one they had to face. She looked out at the simple wooden cross she had planted, its form stark against the new green of the hillside. She nodded slowly. "I'll always miss the man I married," she said, her voice soft and honest. "But he was gone long before he died." She turned to look at Elias, meeting his gaze directly. "When I first looked at you, I saw a ghost. I saw everything I had lost. But I do not see him in your eyes anymore." She reached out and touched his scarred hand, her fingers gently tracing the raised, healed flesh. "I see something better." The words were a balm, a release he had not known he was waiting for. He squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of her truth, and for a long moment, they just sat there, their shared past finally at peace. That spring, they began to rebuild. With lumber donated by their neighbors and the help of a few men from town, they laid a new foundation where the old barn had stood. They worked side by side, from sunup to sundown. He would saw the boards, and she would hold them steady. She would hand him the nails, and he would hammer them home. They moved together in an easy, unspoken partnership, their hands often brushing, their laughter mingling with the sound of the hammer and saw. They were not just rebuilding a barn, they were building a future, hand in hand. One night, after a long day of work, they sat inside the cabin, the comfortable quiet settling around them. The fire cast a warm, golden glow on the walls. He was leaning back in his chair, his eyes closed, a rare, peaceful expression on his face. Clara went to him and knelt by his side. She rested her head on his chest, feeling the steady, solid beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was the sound of life, of strength, of permanence. She lifted her head and touched his chest, her fingers tracing the line of his collarbone. He opened his eyes and looked down at her, his expression soft and questioning. She smiled, a small, secret smile. "You're not him," she whispered, the words a gentle echo of a desperate, long-ago plea. "But you're mine." He pulled her closer, his hand coming up to cup her face. A lifetime of running, of grief, of believing he was unworthy of peace, finally fell away in her eyes. He did not see a woman he had to save or a ghost he had to replace. He saw a home, and for the first time in his life, Elias Granger let himself believe he deserved to stay. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.